Good day, students. The last part of the question just asked you to comment on the solvency and liquidity of AVI Limited. So what I've done here is I've compiled the liquidity and the solvency ratios. I've also included the industry and the norm. So the industry was provided here above, and then you needed to compute all these ratios, and then you needed to comment on what is happening between the solvency and the liquidity. Okay? If you look at the cash ratios, your cash ratio is usually lower than the norm. However, in 2020, you were above the industry norm of 0.1, which means you had quite a few cash resources come through in the 2020 year. Okay, if you look at the other ratios of 1.25, here your current ratio had dipped in 2019, but it's recovered, so you're within the industry norm. And here your quick ratio is 0.7, here it's 0.74, you're also within the industry norm, but it had dipped in 2019. Okay, so liquidity wasn't great, it had dipped in 2019 overall, but your cash generation from operations has increased by 13% in 2020, which has improved your cash ratio and all your other ratios. Working capital cash is lower by 124 million, meaning improved debtor collection. So you've managed to improve a lot of your debtor collections, which means your cash has come through. A large portion of your current assets is in debtors and inventory. You can also comment on that. And then when we talk to some of your solvency balances, you have to compute all these solvency ratios. Large portion of the debt on balance sheet, but a large profit being able to cover your interest costs. So here your normal industry norm for your interest cover is 10 times. You sitting with around 16 times being able to cover your interest cover. So huge a portion above the industry norm that's come through here. And the portion of debt paid up in 2020, but still a large amounts of dividends also being paid out by management. Okay, so this is just your commentary on the liquidity and solvency ratio. And now we can move on to Perfect Paints, which was your management accounting section. Okay, so if we were to start here with your management accounting section, you needed to understand the two types of paints that are produced. And then we've got the question set coming through here. Here they've asked you to prepare the budgeted income statement of Perfect Paints, 15 marks. And that's quite a lot of marks just to prepare the income statement because a lot of the information was already provided. Okay, so if we were to go up here, okay, the budgeted income statement here, most people were able to get this correct. The only thing is some people didn't get your manufacturing overheads correct. So here I've highlighted in red, this is your manufacturing overheads. I've also calculated here a gross profit percentage, but you got basically a profit and loss figure of negative 1.67 million for ProTouch and 1.264 for Best Guard. All right, so this was quite simple. Here you're doing is just your sales, cost of sales, and then remember your cost of sales in your absorption income statement. You have your direct materials, direct labor, and any manufacturing overheads that come through there. We had already provided you here in the question with what are the direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overheads. Okay, direct labor here you've already calculated it of 10 and 6. What other people then went and did and still put in another labor broker. Because the labor broker is already here in the direct labor and you bringing in another labor broker, you are double accounting. Okay, you were only meant to bring in this figure here of 10 million and 6.25 million rand. Okay, this is just giving you more information that the direct labor is sourced from a local labor broker who ensures that laborers are available at the request of Perfect Paints. They're just giving you more information on this line item. You did not have to go and calculate it again. So once we've completed the income statement and gotten the gross profit percentages, now we can move on to question C. Question C asks us to analyze the anticipated financial performance of Perfect Paints and recommend improvements. So the first thing we need to pick up on is the gross profit. We need to mention the fact that the one has a gross profit of 13.95 versus the one of 19.7. So if we compare the two products, gross profit of ProTouch is much lower than that of Best Guard, But this could be because of the incorrect allocation basis. So you also needed to mention the fact that ProTouch will have a lower gross profit because it is overcosted because of the use of a volume-based allocation rather than any other types of other cost drivers that they can use to allocate it. And therefore, BestGuard is undercosted. And if you were to complete a contribution margin, looking at your variable costs on each, your variable contribution margins, your contribution margin on both would be around 36-37%. So your gross profit figure is clearly very distorted because of the incorrect allocation basis. Okay, the company is making a loss. So you could say that it's understandable given that it's a startup company. We expected to have an increase in demand for ProTouch, which is the ProTouch type of paint, but they are still loss making. The issue is you cannot discontinue ProTouch because it is generating the most revenue and covering the bulk of the cost. So if you were to look here at your sales figure, you're only getting 38.2 from BestGuard versus the 59.5. So a huge amount of revenue coming through that is able to cover your fixed costs on a ProTouch basis. Not a lot of people mention that. Okay. So a lot of people mentioned either you have to try and reduce ProTouch or try and adjust the costs. But one thing you need to mention is the fact that it's covering a lot of your fixed costs, given that the revenue contribution is quite significant from a ProTouch basis. Okay, then we could talk about some of the recommendations. You could increase the selling prices. If this reduces then demand, you look at how you can actually negotiate better prices, maybe to some of your builders. The point number 2, you can also either sell smaller containers at higher prices. So you've got a fixed container that you're selling it at. Maybe look to actually differentiate and do a bit of price discrimination. A larger bottle of paint is a lot more, is a lot cheaper. So maybe have a smaller bottle and try and price correctly the smaller containers. Number 3, you can negotiate discounts with suppliers for your raw materials. Number 4, you could also save your labor broker costs. So your labor broker costs are costing you quite a bit. If you were to remove them from the organization, you would actually move closer to profits. So there you could save between 1.1 million and 1.6 million if you removed the labor broker. Number 5, you can understand the different cost behaviors using activity-based costing system and remove any non-value adding activities. And number 6, you can look to increase your production capacity. You've still got to cover a lot of your fixed costs, and there's room for production capacity in terms of your machine hours and based on what you're producing versus your planned production. So you can also have room for expansion. Those are the recommendations that should have come through. Then the last part of the question, most people managed to get some of the recommendations correct, just to comment on how you guys did in this question. But the problem is you didn't give enough recommendations. If you guys looked at the mark allocation, it was 13. You needed to provide a lot more detail on your analysis of the 2 companies and your recommendations. Some people only offered 2 recommendations. So the only reason you suffered there is because you weren't expanding your answer quite full enough. Okay, last part of the question is question D, which is the critical evaluation of the allocation of fixed overheads. A lot of people did not do well in this section. Reason being is I'm not sure if you didn't understand the question or you hadn't read the question carefully, but what I did ask you to do, and this carried quite a few marks, which is 22 marks, and a lot of people scored quite badly in this section, is you needed to evaluate the allocation of only the fixed manufacturing overheads. Okay, so they had given you here a drill down of the manufacturing overheads down here, and you now needed to evaluate the allocation of them between the ProTouch and BestGuard and make recommendations for improvement. So you needed to make a recommendation for each of these costs, the way they've allocated them. What would you recommend they do in terms of allocating to each of these? You can see that it carries 22 marks. So if you're not putting any 22 points, you're not going to score fully on this 22 marker. So I was quite disappointed in the responses that I received in question D. A lot of people did not put effort in this section. There's one syndicate that looked at it very well, and that's the syndicate that scored the highest mark in the syndicate assignment of around, I think, 89%. They did quite well in this section. But everyone else did not put effort in this last part of the question. Okay, so the first thing you need to do is when you're critically evaluating the allocation of the fixed overheads, you need to mention that they are still using a traditional allocation method, but that they can actually use an activity-based costing method. The problem with the traditional allocation method, it uses one single cost driver, which is your volume of production, which can be the worst cost driver in terms of allocating between the two products. Okay, you mentioned why. You mentioned that this allocation method can result in an inaccurate allocation of costs. So you guys needed to mention why you think they should move away from the traditional. And what you've seen there, based on what you've looked at with the contribution margin versus the gross profit margin, they are overcosting ProTouch and they are undercosting BestCard, which is the low volume product. Okay, and then this also might impact on what you're charging and your markup that you're charging and the resultant demand on each of these products. If you probably priced ProTouch more better, in a better way, you potentially could have a higher demand and higher sales. And if you've undercosted BestCard, maybe this is the reason why you're actually seeing such a huge gross profit margin, but you'd see a lower gross profit margin. Okay, if you looked at the overall fixed costs as a percentage of revenue, they're quite high. Okay, your fixed overheads make up over 20% of the revenue. So you want to allocate these costs correctly. Okay, so then now we look at each of the cost drivers, and now these are the reasons why that you guys should have picked up. Your batch setup costs. Okay, it's a mixed cost, so you needed to identify the fixed component and then allocate it based on the total number of setups. So some of the teams got this right, that you needed to look at the total number of setups, but you needed to look at how you're going to allocate it. Currently, 67% of the cost is allocated to ProTouch, but on the new basis, 67% will go to BestCard. So this is a total switch in the cost allocation between the two products because of the number of batch setups that ProTouch has versus BestCard. Okay, then the rental premises. Rental premises, you can look at the area occupied by each production line, but remember, Perfect Paints only has one production line, or you could look at how long they use the facility for, your utilization of your premises. ProTouch uses the facility for 12 months, BestCard uses this for 10 months, so you could separate out the cost also based on how long they use the facility. Okay, water and electricity, the same, how they utilize the premises. You could also mention the same points that you mentioned for the rental of the premises. Okay, next point, depreciation of machine. Because it's the depreciation of the machine, as you use the machine, you're using it up, which comes through depreciation. So your machine hours will be the best cost driver. So therefore, an equal allocation of costs between the two. Another switch between ProTouch to BestCard. Okay, based on machine hours. Salaries, BestCard requires more labor time and the current allocation does not reflect. So alternatively, you could look at what are the labor hours that have contributed to each of the products. Okay, it will result in more allocation towards BestCard relative to what is currently being allocated if you looked at it based on the labor hours. So you could have commented here that salaries needed to be based on labor hours. Okay, any other manufacturing overheads, we need to look at the composition of those costs, investigate what are the best cost drivers to use. So if you just mentioned, okay, what is the appropriate, consider maybe the cost benefit of additional information, or we could use volume. What percentage is other manufacturing? It's only 2,200, so it's quite a small percentage. Given the cost benefit, we might just allocate that one based on volume, but you could also have given any other good reasons as to how you'd allocate, and I would have provided you the marks. Okay, that's it in terms of the question D. I hope you guys can look here at the solution that I've provided here on the recording and go through what you guys were doing wrong in your questions. Happy for you guys to email me. Thank you.